I can hardly contain my excitement saying this, but I'm sewing another suit. Of all the things I like to sew, practically nothing gets me salivating like the prospect of making another one of these bad boys. I think I read somewhere that the construction of a handmade coat like this should take an apprentice tailor around 40 hours, so 1 working week. Only, I don't do this for work, and I'm not an apprentice. So let's say it's more like 60 hours, which, allowing that I have 1 day a week to work on this, plus maybe a few evenings here and there, means I'm looking at, what, 6 weeks of jacket making joy? And of course, then there's the trousers. Call that another 2 weeks. And I've started it not a moment too soon either, since it needs to be ready in, well, about 8 weeks. Now, we're in the last days of May as I speak, and so here in the Northern Hemisphere, summer is approaching at a fair old lick. And as such, I thought it was high time that I try my hand at a classic warm weather fabric that I'm not sure I'd ever really properly sewn with. Namely, linen, or okay, well, fine, you win, an 82%, 18% linen cotton blend. And I've opted for this rather beautiful chocolate brown colour. I'm very fond of it, and I only hope I can do it justice. As far as the pattern and the details are concerned, I'm not really varying too much on the last suit that I made. So I've tapered the jacket's fit in a couple of places, and I've slightly altered the shape of the front edge, but otherwise I'm really just sticking with what I've got going on. Now, I was pretty satisfied with the way the last jacket turned out, but obviously I've not quite perfected the pattern or indeed the construction techniques, and so I figured it was best not to make any drastic changes to the formula just yet. Nah, I'd rather do that in a big panic somewhere down the line. Well, I'm desperately trying to work out why nothing is fitting. Otherwise, the only significant style change I've made is doing patched hip pockets like this, instead of jetted ones with flaps. Again, this is going to be for summer, which I would say is one of the more casual seasons, and so I just wanted to imbue this garment with a little bit of that playfulness. What on earth am I talking about? No, my hope is simply to finally, or at least almost finally, get these pesky patterns nailed down for good. Because once I have, well, then I can really start making some irresponsible style decisions. Speaking of irresponsible decisions, I'm trying something new with my canvas, which in my idiot hands will prove merely ineffective if I'm lucky, and downright fatal if I'm not. So a few times now I've gone back to rewatch this really interesting video on Kirby Allison's channel, where he's talking to bespoke tailor Stephen Hitchcock. In it, Hitchcock talks Kirby through some of the behind the scenes techniques and decisions that go into the making of a high-end bespoke jacket. Oh yeah, much like the one I'm trying to make. And one of the things Hitchcock talked about with regards to his own cutting style and process was cutting his canvases slightly on the bias, which is to say cutting it so that the grain of the canvas fabric doesn't run straight down vertically, but rather at a slight diagonal compared to the straight grain line of the garment panel itself. By doing this and essentially rotating the canvas panels out of the stability of their fabric's vertical horizontal grain cross-grain structure, you give the canvas some added flexibility to settle and mold itself over time around the body of the wearer. Now, Stephen Hitchcock is a master cutter with decades of experience at the top of his game, and I'm a bozo hobbyist with a bit too much time on my hands. Nevertheless, I impulsively decided to give this a go, and only time will tell just how misguided that decision may or may not have been. But my hope is that in this lightweight linen garment that will likely anyway be prone to a little bit of crinkling and crumpling, any possible, if not probable malfunctions will be disguised by the garment fabric's own crinkly, crumply nature. Yeah, as consolations go, that's pretty bleak, isn't it? Otherwise, my canvas has been constructed more or less exactly like my wedding suit one. Light to mid-weight wool cotton canvas fabric, and the plastron, or that chest padding panel, made of that horsehair reinforcement fabric and covered with some nice cotton flannel to stop it from scratching through the lining. In the making of a suit, there are a few steps more satisfying than this one. You can really feel the front panels absorbing the structure of the canvas, and most importantly, you really feel the bliss, the euphoria, the unadulterated serenity of spending 2 straight hours pad stitching the canvas into the lapels. Now, the magical insides of this jacket obviously deserve better, but I'm afraid the time has come to hide them under a lining. Now, I've had a bit of an odd relationship with my linings over the years. Honestly, I just don't really think I have much of an eye for fabric matching. I honestly feel a little bit terrified, not to mention mildly disgusted by some of the rather more flamboyant lining fabrics out there in the world. And usually, for a blend of budgetary and supply reasons, I tend to just go for a monochrome cotton. Easy peasy, right? Only, because I don't really trust myself to pick the right colour on a screen, I'm stuck at the mercy of whatever my local stores can supply. And sometimes they just don't quite have the right shade of this, that, or the other. But you know, at least it's relatively inoffensive. Or, if I find later that it is actually quite offensive, at least it's relatively subdued. And you know, it is a lining after all, so I guess worst case, I can just never take the jacket off. I do usually find the lining fun to sew. Usually. And above all, it's a relief to be hiding away all these funky innards, which, though lovingly assembled and indeed deeply respected, are a little bit hectic to the eye. top. And then there's a real kick to be gotten out of seeing the jacket fronts more or less fully assembled. And I do rather adore making these pockets. Now that particular style is called the Barcelona pocket, and it is actually surprisingly easy to make. I mean, there are all sorts of weird and wonderful pockets that you can find on the insides of suit jackets, and for all sorts of fanciful purposes that the modern, enterprising, jet-setting, cigar-puffing, martini-guzzling man about town may need accommodating. A little pen pouch maybe, or somewhere to stash those aforementioned cheroots. Maybe a passport, or a hip flask, or, I don't know, a monocle. Thankfully, however, I do not belong to that class of gentlemen, so all I really need is one plain old pocket for, well, historically speaking, supermarket receipts and old bottle caps. I don't know what to tell you. 100-hour tailoring projects notwithstanding, I'm a man with simple pleasures. Speaking of simple pleasures, you're looking at one, although possibly it doesn't look all that simple to you. And if you sew yourself, and if you've ever sewn anything with a collar, which this is, then probably it didn't have all that much in common with this handsome gentleman, either in terms of how it was put together or what it looked like during the process. The handmaking of a suit jacket collar exemplifies, I think, both the effectiveness and the beauty traditional tailoring techniques. First things first, you have one strange fabric after another, which is to say two, but not that there's a law that says you can only sew either of them by hand, but where would be the fun otherwise, eh? You've got this linen canvas here, which helps give the collar its firm structure. And then on the other side, you have collar melton forming the undercollar, this being a very dense felt-like wool that also firms up the structure, while providing a presentable layer for all you collar-popping lunatics to show off to the world. And beyond these funky little fabrics, pretty much every aspect of the collar's construction by hand hinges on some sly little idea or technique that a machine-based construction just isn't able to support. To wit, that gorgeous pad stitching, well, theoretically gorgeous, which I already hooted and hollered in praise of earlier. This served to connect both the canvas and the melton across their whole surface area, while this semicircular pattern of stitches enabled the bias of both fabrics to be exploited to shape the collar, using the iron, into the necessary three-dimensional shape. The bias being the diagonal angle that cuts between the two straight grains of the fabric. And by cutting on the bias, you deny your fabrics the stability of those straight grains and make them, essentially, flexible. And to reduce the bulk of these chunky fabrics, they actually have no seam allowance. Instead, they're cross-stitched by hand, flat onto the neckline seam allowance, for the garment fabric top collar is hand-stitched on top of it in turn. Every unnecessary excess is done without, while every hand stitch executes a function that the machine's design simply can't. And eventually every last edge will be slip-stitched or prick-stitched into its final position, achieving a finish that perfectly blends the functional with the aesthetic. I do love my machine, but it is nice to have all this extra space. Fun as this all is though, I might postpone those final stitches for now. After all, as far as simple pleasures go, there is no pleasure more simple than lunch. After all, it's a tricky business doing all this DIY tailoring on an empty stomach, and allow me to tell you that there is no stage of the jacket construction trickier than this one. Making and then setting the sleeves. Also in the world of professional tailoring, as I understand it, sleeves can often be the culprits behind those more troublesome jackets. You need to ensure that the angle at which it falls matches that of the arm, that sufficient ease has been included in the top of the sleeve, and that this ease is then correctly spread around the armhole itself. Otherwise, the head of the sleeve, when it's sewn in, will be all puckered and nasty, instead of smooth, stately, and, dare I say it, stunning. So, actually, I take back what I said earlier. Making the sleeves is pretty low key. The fiddliest part of it is making this cuff vent, but really, even then, worst case scenario, it's hidden on the inside. No, it's mostly just the setting of the sleeves that really stings, and for, give or take, two main reasons, I'd say. First, simply because it's the point at which you commit to all those calculations and checks that you've made regarding the ease, the hang of the sleeve, the size of the armhole, this, that, and the other. And secondly, because simply doing it is itself a rather surgical procedure. I hope any surgeons watching this will forgive me the hyperbole. If you're relatively unpracticed at it like me, then it can take a decent while to get it done properly. And if you're relatively unpracticed at it like me, then you might find that all your checks and calculations were still off to begin with, and you're going to have to do it all again. But like manipulating the bias when making the collar, it really is a brilliant technique that ideally delivers brilliant results, both in terms of fit and look. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times the idea of ease. And what I mean in this instance is that the upper sleeve opening is larger than the armhole that it's going to fit into, around 5 centimeters or 2 inches longer, to be clear if not exact. This excess is going to allow the wearer extra mobility and comfort in the upper arm, but to enlarge the armhole itself to accommodate this would both defeat this particular purpose and upset other aspects of the fit, which we don't want. Instead, you spread the excess around the armhole using these hand stitches. And once you've done that and established there are no really dramatic puckers along the edge, you take it to the iron and you press those ripples away from the inside. And while the ripples along the stitch line itself disappear, ideally, the extra fabric in the sleeve cap itself, just a few centimeters beyond, remains, allowing for that extra mobility, comfort, and so on. And this is when you actually machine stitch it. Itself a persnickety process, but one usually laced with a little bit of relief. Because if you have made it this far, you'll know it's because you got all of those earlier steps, the tricky ones, correct by now. And if you've come this far without trusting that you've done all the previous steps correctly, well, all I can say is, who would do a thing like that? And I'll tell you what's always a relief after finishing the jacket: making the trousers. Not only is the suit incomplete without them, of course, but they're also, compared to the jacket, a fair bit easier to make. One admittedly long day's work if you've got all your ducks in a row. Yes, I know I said 2 weeks work for the trousers earlier, but believe me, tweaking the pattern was, and sadly for me usually is, around 13 days work. Trousers though can be more than enough of a challenge, even if, like me, you're making something like your 10th pair. The fit, honestly, can be as tricky as the jackets, if not trickier. You've got 2 tubes that need to fall around your legs in just the right way, attached to a crotch piece, a glorified pair of briefs if you like, which ideally should wrap around that complicated axis in a way that yields few to no creases. No mean feat, I'm telling you. No mean feat. Surely there's a pun in there somewhere. Anyway, now as I've raved before, I really do love making trousers, despite my ongoing struggle to find the perfect fit. I kind of think they're the perfect garment, and with the satisfaction of knowing they'll be joining a suit ensemble, it's always a bit more exciting to be making a pair like this. I'm still making up my mind about a few bells and whistles. Do I include side tab adjusters? What kind of button fastening will I use? Etc. But otherwise we're looking at normal rise trousers with a slant pocket and a somewhat deep pleat. You can honestly feel quite luxurious putting trousers together. With the jacket there often ends up being several layers, what with the canvas and the lining and honestly who knows what else. Well, the trousers, I guess, unless you're lining them, which I'm not, remain rather delicate and dainty, at least until they're finished. And while I still don't trust myself to correctly put on a fly zipper, there are a few, if any, individual steps that really boggle the mind, not like setting the jacket sleeves, for instance. It's been quite the journey putting this suit together, as it always is. Whether my patterns have been perfected as I'd hoped remains to be seen. Hang on. When? Well, for me, thanks to this rather hilarious zipper blooper, a little while yet. But for you, thanks to some movie magic, we can jump right to it. Oh, can't even remember how long that actually took. Anywhere between 4 weeks and 84 years. But here I am, here it is. Dare I say it, she blows. With anything like sewing or tailoring that's creative slash, I don't know, artisanal, it can be quite difficult sometimes to ignore your own instinctive criticisms. But in this case, most of those criticisms seem to be ignoring themselves. I'm actually very happy with how this has turned out. Another minuscule step for tailoring, but another humongous leap for yours truly. And as you may have noticed, this little suit has already served its main purpose. This is the outfit I just got married in a couple of weeks ago, not like this morning, which, going by wedding dress logic, I suppose means I can never wear this again.